And think of the difference between a Christian who's thriving spiritually versus one whose faith is lackluster. Now, there's various factors that we could focus on, but the one that we're going to consider this morning is passion. Synonyms for passion are hunger, appetite, zeal, and enthusiasm. So we have an idea what a marriage looks like when passion has gone out of it. And we know what an employee looks like when he's lost his zeal for his work. Revelation 2 gives us a sense for how Jesus feels when the passion for serving him has gone out of the congregation, or when passion has left a Christian's heart. Jesus describes this as, "You have left your first love." I'm not going to read that all over again, since Terry just read it for us. But the description from Jesus, it kind of takes me by surprise. And it's because when I think of a church that has left its first love, my mind doesn't go to a fellowship that toils and perseveres and has not grown weary. Rather, I think of one that's lethargic, where its people are just basically putting in the minimum time. But Jesus said that they left, departed from, deserted, forsook, left alone, left behind their first love. Now, at the time when their fellowship was first formed, the church in Ephesus had a zeal from the heart for Jesus and for his work. But over the decades, that fire of the zeal for Jesus began to fade. And it faded. As it faded, their service to Jesus might have still looked faithful, at least from an outside appearance. But the fervor from the heart, that had departed. Perhaps the best way to understand this looks like when children come along into marriage, we can enter a season of marriage when we can be so busy, dutifully carrying out all that's necessary to function as husband and wife and as parents, that our relationship to our spouse begins to feel hollowed out. We can look back at how we felt for one another in our pre-children days, and it just feels different now. We're caring for one another's needs to function to stay alive, but the deeper heart connection feels like a flickering candle, or maybe even like the winds of life blew it out. And this is a critically vulnerable time in marriage when Satan has an open opportunity to throw some big difficulties our way, and marital conflict can snuff out whatever love was left. Now, when a Christian or a congregation has lost their love of Christ, or has lost the fervor that once characterized their faith, it is then that Satan has an open opportunity to take advantage of hearts that are vulnerable. It's like the wife, after 60 years of marriage, laments to her husband, "I don't think I've heard you tell me you loved me since our wedding day." And he responds, "I told you back then that I loved you, and if I ever change my mind, I'll let you know." The way we treat God in this life gives a picture of how earnestly we actually yearn to be with him in eternity. If what motivates us in our faith is primarily that we don't want to go to hell, that is not going to capture the relational dynamics of the loving bond that God desires to have with us. Treating God that way is like a woman saying, "Well, I've got two choices. I don't want to marry Tom, so I guess I'll just marry you instead." Likewise, with God, it's not good enough to just follow a bunch of rules to avoid hell. No, God is looking for us to desire him, to be absorbed with who he is, and then from that context, serve him with passion, with a desirous enthusiasm. Let's look again at this phrase, you have left your first love. It's saying you have left, departed from, forsook, left behind your agape. You have deserted your first love. Which brings up the question, what is agape? Our mind naturally goes to 1 Corinthians 13. Love is patient, love is kind and is not jealous. Love does not brag, is not arrogant, does not act unbecomingly. It does not seek its own, is not provoked, does not take into account a wrong suffered, does not rejoice in unrighteousness, but rejoices with the truth, bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Love never fails. Love is an action and not merely a feeling. And those actions need a recipient who obtain the benefit of them. The recipients would be the others in our life. But Revelation 2 appears to suggest Jesus was the first love that they left behind. Yes, but what did Jesus say in his parable of the great judgment in Matthew 25? It says, it talks about the king talking about I'll just read the whole thing. Then the king will say to those on his right, come, you who are blessed of my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. Naked, you clothed me, and I was sick, and you visited me. I was in prison, and you came to me. And then the righteous will answer him, Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink? Or when did we see you a stranger and invite you in, or naked and clothe you? When did we see you sick or in prison and come to you? The king will answer and say to them, truly I say to you, to the extent that you did it to one of these brothers of mine, even the least of them, you did it to me. So we as humans never physically laid our eyes on God. And I think I can assume that we never heard him speak audibly to any of us. So it can be harder to wrap our minds around having a relationship with him that is going to be just as real as a relationship with a loved one that's here on earth. I say it's harder, but it's not impossible. And it seems that those the king were speaking to in this parable likewise felt that he was distant from them. So each party involved was actually quite surprised when the king told them that they did or they did not do the things for him that he had mentioned. So the parable lays out a principle of what a relationship with God can look like for those who can't wrap their minds around directly sensing his presence, but also for those who do sense his presence. What that relationship looks like is one anothering those around us. One anothering those around us. So when we lose our first love, the solution to that problem is putting zeal back into how we love and serve one another. What does zeal for God look like with its work boots on, so to speak? Well, being patient, kind, and not jealous, not bragging or being arrogant, not acting rude or selfish, not being easily angered, keeping no account of wrongs, not taking pleasure in wrongdoing, but rather rejoicing in truth, bearing all things, believing all things, hoping all things, and enduring all things. Think of it this way. Suppose a man was courting a widow. The surest way to that lady's heart is for the man to show kindness and love toward her children. By showing agape to her children, he is showing it to her. Now, while it might sound strange, using this analogy, put God into the widow's place. And those around us are the widow's children. We show love to God by showing love to his children. Truly I say to you, to the extent that you did it to one of these brothers of mine, even the least of them, you did it to me. When we lose our first love, the solution is putting zeal back into how we love and serve one another. So did you ever ponder what makes the difference between a dead church that isn't growing and a vibrant church that is thriving, where the brethren are on fire for God? There's at least one common denominator, a practical difference. A thriving church has brethren who are zealous for God, who make themselves available to serve others. They have a passion for service, a passion for living out their faith, a passion for pleasing God. So this one's for Pete. Told you I had a slide in here for you, Pete. Pete does not like schnauzers. So a schnauzer is a dog, but not all dogs are schnauzers, fortunately, right, Pete? In like manner, not every church that is active in one another's lives is right with God. However, every church that is right with God has brethren who are active in serving others. We excel at whatever it is that we have a passion for. We excel at serving God when we have a passion for pleasing God. Proverbs 22:29 says, "Do you see a man skilled in his work? He will stand before kings. He will not stand before obscure men." So I've got this fascination for wheelwrights, for the work of a wheelwright. And if you know anything about the design principles behind wooden wheels, you realize that it's not as simple as it appears. There's many design variations like the hub offset, spoke shape, and the steel tire width, depending on the application. Now, what's impressive is the consistency of the spokes and the assembled wheel using only jigs and hand tools. So a tradesman, such as a wheelwright, becomes more proficient in his work when he has a passion for what he does. His zeal and his interest shows in his work, and he finds satisfaction in doing his work well. If you're feeling bored with your faith, do some introspection as to where your passion is. It's good to have a zeal for your trade, but do you have a zeal for God? Now, hunger can lead us to a bad place at times, but considering the synonyms for passion, hunger and appetite, just ponder the energy that someone exerts when attempting to satiate their intense hunger. Now liken that same single-eyed vigor to someone trying to accomplish the object of their passion. It's a drive that refuses to deviate off course from the pursuit until that goal is realized. Now, we saw that kind of passion in Jesus at the cross. There was no way Jesus was willing to be deterred from accomplishing his mission. No sin was worth jeopardizing his work. So what drove Jesus to hold fast with a passion to his mission? Hebrews 12 explains, "Let us also lay aside every encumbrance and the sin which so easily entangles us, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith, who, for the joy set before him, endured the cross, despising the shame, and he sat down at the right hand of God, right hand of the throne of God." So Jesus had the joy of victory, the vision of the coming victory over having this eternal plan accomplished. Now, it was a shameful thing to be put on the cross to die. But verse 2 says that Jesus despised that shame. In other words, he disregarded it because he had such a passion to defeat the work of Satan. Interestingly, that word passion is used in a different way as well. The English word passion is derived from the Latin word passio. This word means suffering. The expression, the passion of Christ, thus came to describe the afflictions Christ endured for our sins on that last day of his life. Is there a passion in our hearts to defeat the works of Satan? So what does passion look like in service to others? Sometimes it needs to look like doing whatever is necessary to get the job done to fill someone's need. James 2 talks about what use is it, brethren, if someone says he has faith but he has no works? Can that faith save him? If a brother or sister is without clothing and in need of daily food, and one of you says to them, go in peace, be warmed and be filled, and yet you do not give them what is necessary for their body, what use is that? Even so, faith, if it has no works, is dead, being by itself. So when some task to help another looks daunting or unpleasant, there are times when you just need to buckle down and throw yourself at it and work up the zeal to stick with it until it's done. I recall a work party some years ago at Cindy's house to tear down an old deck. And this would have been a major undertaking if it was just one or two people. But it ended up being a lot of fun because we all had a good time because the work party was well attended. You've heard that phrase, many hands make work light. So serving the needs of others is not always fun, but it's almost always rewarding. And I think that reward from serving is by God's design. Those who say, be warmed and be filled, and are able-bodied, but who always spurn the opportunities to do things for others, all I can say is that they're missing a huge faith-building blessing for themselves. Jesus explained, it's more blessed to give than to receive. And I will say that many of these opportunities to serve other people are not even known about by others. They're not announced. People just do it quietly, privately, with other people. So there are people in service to others, doing things for others who you never even know it. Zeal for God's work is not only rewarding, but our passion for Christ is also hard to ignore. It can be magnetic to be in the presence of, particularly of those seeking to know God. And it can ignite interest in people for the hope that we have. 1 Peter 3 says, but sanctify Christ as Lord in your hearts, always being ready to make a defense to everyone who asks you to give an account for the hope that is in you, yet with gentleness and reverence. Enthusiasm with love is contagious. People were drawn to Jesus not by his outward appearance, based on the passage from Isaiah, but rather by how he demonstrated the character of God so completely that his life was magnetic to those who were seeking after God. His life whetted people's appetite for the things of God. Since we are wired for God, made in God's image, when people are in the presence of godly passion, their interest is animated by our zeal. So it whets their appetite for the things of God. Our faith and enthusiasm will give witness to the hope that lies within us. A zealous faith also encourages those who are already in the faith. So consider now what level of zeal we have for the Lord and for his work. Where is our desire? Is it for pleasing God, or is it for some earthly purpose? Now, some people don't possess the knack for starting things, and that's fine. But they can be encouraged to participate in a work if someone else takes the lead and gets the fire started. Many successful ministries rest on the shoulders of only one or two people, someone with vision and desire to give birth to some work, and their enthusiasm fuels them to nurture the work and to keep the energy level up. I enjoy showing this picture every opportunity I get. While visiting some friends who attend the West Monroe congregation a few years ago, I got the opportunity to sit in Willie Robertson's desk and put my office and put my feet up on his desk the way he does. I will say I did that at the urging of his relative. It wasn't my idea, but he got a kick out of it. Well, he was giving us a tour of their warehouse there. But more importantly than that picture is the picture of that thrift store. That's run by women who came out of terrible pasts, and I'm talking terrible. Drug addiction, crimes, Some came out of jail just spitting and just being nasty to the people who were trying to help them, and their lives were turned around. They were benefited by this ministry that was started by this certain couple. The couple I'm referring to, they bought that building with their own money, and they set this effort into motion. And that's a testament to the incredible power that resides in empty vessels who allow themselves to be filled with and used by the Holy Spirit. Now, not all of our works is going to look like that, but everything that we do to bless someone else is important. Don't think it has to be something of that nature. I'm just showing that what can be done with people who really are devoted, and they not only put their time but their money behind it. Now, in my 4 decades with our congregation here, I've seen programs started for evangelism, for visitation, and for some other work, and materials were brought, maybe a speaker was brought in, but by and large, these efforts, they fizzled out or they never really took root. Now, in contrast to that, our congregation has had highly successful works through the years, works that were started by someone who had an idea and they had the enthusiasm and faith to carry it out. I have a list of some of these ways that our congregation shows its zeal for God. Bringing food to shut-ins, new mothers, and those with medical challenges, one-on-one Bible studies, transporting older brethren to appointments, and some of these appointments are in Anchorage. Couples dinners, new song service, homemakers through homeschooling and raising their children for God, young servants nights, hospitality, inviting people to our homes for meals or for lodging, heart-to-heart dinners, home singings, home studies, Kids for Christ card ministry. I think of how Sharon remembers our birthdays and anniversaries. We got hospice, Right to Life, Financial Peace University, mission trips, Givers of Benevolence, building, upkeep, and repair. And I could just go on. The list is, this is by no means exhaustive. Now, I liken each of these good works as flowers that are planted in a garden. Now, oftentimes we could take flowers for granted. I remember going over to the Ukraine, and in 1993 or 4, and the place just looked very utilitarian, just bland. It was just the testament to communism and how utilitarian it is, and just crushes the beauty around them. And so we could take flowers for granted. When you go to some place where there is no flowers, you kind of get it. But what flowers do is they add beauty and joy to an otherwise lifeless patch of ground. Realize that these works of love, sometimes headed up by only one person, makes the difference between a lifeless church and a thriving group of family in the faith, where a taste of heaven has been brought to our lives. These works of love and zeal sometimes are the very thing that got someone through a discouraging time. In Romans 12, Paul describes how the church is made up of many parts of the body, and each part was to serve with zeal. It says, be devoted to one another in brotherly love, give preference to one another in honor, not lagging behind in diligence, fervent in spirit, serving the Lord. Now, this describes a functional church, a body which encourages the equipping of the brotherhood to look for good works, and then encourages the brethren to pursue their interests of service for Christ. It's similar to how bone and muscle complement each other. Now, bone provides a sturdy structure, but it cannot move without the muscle. Muscles, in contrast, they want to move and be active. Without the structure of the bone, the muscle's movement would not accomplish anything. And without the flexibility and motive forces of the muscle, the sturdiness of the bone would serve no purpose. They must be attached to one another in order for each of them to accomplish good things. So bone and muscle are very different from one another, yet they can only be functional when together. So the analogy here is, as a fellowship, we are quite different from one another in some cases, but we need each other to function for the Lord. So before I close, I'm going to consider, let's consider what hinders zeal for God. So if I could boil it down to one major factor, there's other things, but this is probably the one major factor that comes to mind, is becoming distracted by too much interest in the things of this world. When we live for ourselves, we lose our zeal for God. When we live for ourselves, we lose our zeal for God. Matthew 13:22 says, "And the one on whom seed was sown among the thorns, this is the man who hears the word, and the worry of the world and the deceitfulness of wealth choke the word, and it becomes unfruitful." 1 Timothy 6:10 says, "For the love of money is a root of all sorts of evil, and some by longing for it have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many griefs." So this wandering away from the faith after earthly stuff is the spiritual equivalent of a husband wandering away after another woman. Earthly pleasures easily become an attractive distraction of the heart. You know, it's been said that money talks, but what hasn't been said often enough is that it talks too loud. Covetousness can be compared to a marital relationship where when a spouse gets around someone of the opposite gender, someone other than their spouse, and then they light up and they show excitement, an excitement that their spouse seldom witnesses when in their presence. And that's not good for the marriage. But applying that scenario to our relationship with our Heavenly Father, how do you think God feels when things of this world excite us, but things pertaining to Him do not? Jesus framed these competing affections in this way in Matthew 6. He says, "No one can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and wealth." This and then one more thing. Here's a few verses to describe the zeal that God wants to see in us. Romans 12, "Be devoted to one another in brotherly love, give preference to one another in honor, not lagging behind, in diligence, fervent in spirit, serving the Lord." 1 Corinthians 15, "Therefore, my beloved brethren, be steadfast, immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, knowing that your toil is not in vain in the Lord." Titus 2:14. Titus in general has a lot of this description about good works, a lot of repetition about good works or good deeds. "Who gave himself for us to redeem us from every lawless deed, and to purify for himself a people for his own possession, zealous for good works." Titus 2:7, "In all things show yourself to be an example of good works, with purity and doctrine dignified." Titus 3:1, "Remind them to be subject to rulers, to authorities, to be obedient, to be ready for every good deed." I said good works, not good deed. Anyway, Titus 3:8, "This is a trustworthy statement, and concerning these things I want you to speak confidently, so that those who have believed God will be careful to engage in good deeds." Titus 3:14, "Our people must also learn to engage in good deeds to meet pressing needs, so that they will not be unfruitful." So one last thing here. About 20 years ago, I was feeling a lot of discouragement, and I just felt like giving in and not swimming upstream anymore. But in sorting through everything that was going on, I told myself, no, I'm not willing to give up now. So at that time, I made up this reminder of what's at stake and how I need to be thinking in order to stick with the path that we started on. To have what others don't, you need to do what others won't. To have what others don't, you need to do what others won't. Now, these days, whenever we travel or we have visitors to our congregation or we have visitors up to our house, I often tell them what a great congregation we have here. We have something here that others don't. I hope you realize that. Let's not lose that. It takes a purposeful focus and sacrifice to live out Christ's precepts in our lives and to shun things and mindsets that Christ is not pleased with. In other words, to have what others don't, you need to do what others won't. So my encouragement this morning is to live with zeal for Christ and His kingdom. If anyone has any need this morning, we have this opportunity to come forward as we stand and sing.